In southern cities, the air smelled not of sulfur from sermons, but of wine, wool, and garlic. In the markets of Toulouse, adult merchants argued about the price of salt and fabrics, while above them, from the porch, words were already being spoken about wicked heretics who allegedly gathered at night, rejected marriage, and turned prayer into debauchery. In the square, people spoke about this with such confidence as if everyone had seen it with their own eyes. At the same time, in cramped rooms on the outskirts, adults in gray clothes prayed until they were exhausted, fasted, renounced marriage, meat, and luxury, considering the body not a source of pleasure, but a prison. The more frightening the stories about sexualized heresy became, the more noticeable another reality emerged in the documents. Behind the tales of sin, a war was being prepared for Languedoc, a rich and stubborn region where taxes, trade, and ambitions converged. Hello, viewers, and thank you for your attention. Imagine the male voice of the narrator, who is now thanking you for listening, asking you to write in the comments where you are watching this story from, and which stories about heresy and wars for faith seem to you the most cruel or the most demonstrably unjust. This voice wishes you a calm but attentive listening experience and invites you to take a closer look at how accusations of debauchery became a convenient tool for conquering an entire region. Let's move on to the story. Under Raymond VI of Toulouse, Languedoc was a densely populated and wealthy southern region, not a remote frontier. Urban communities traded, signed contracts, and adult clerks recorded leases, loans, and marriages day after day in notary offices. The count's power was based on compromises with cities and vassals, not just the sword. Here they spoke Aquitaine, sang about courtly love, and argued about taxes on bridges and markets. The church remained an important force, but alongside the bishops, there were powerful lords and self-confident townspeople. In this intertwining of interests, alongside Catholic priests, appeared people who would later be called Cathars. The texts of the Cathars show not debauchery, but strict asceticism. The perfect ones, adult men and women, rejected marriage, meat, and oaths, striving for maximum abstinence. For them, everything material was associated with the power of evil, and therefore physical pleasure was considered dangerous. They went from house to house among the laity, lived under their protection, ate little, and prayed a lot. Lay people who sympathized with them included donations for their support in their wills and entrusted them with spiritual care, but at the same time continued to enter into ordinary marriage contracts with dowries and obligations, where later sermons depict nightly orgies, sources record many days of fasting, refusal to bear children, and renunciation of property. Why did preachers so persistently describe the Cathars as debauched? The theological dispute over dualism and the nature of matter was too complex for the masses. It was easier to say that heretics rejected pure marriage, that men and women gathered secretly, and that the absence of church marriage allegedly opened the way to all kinds of vice. The Cathar, living in wandering and fasting, was turned in stories into a person who does not recognize the commandments, and therefore, as the preachers claimed, is capable of anything. For an audience concerned with control over physicality and marriage, this worked better than any treatise. Raymond VI found himself at the center of this vortex. He was accused not only of tolerating heresy, but also of having a supposedly debauched court, where heresy and songs not approved by the church were not suppressed. However, his charters and treaties show a ruler preoccupied with taxes, the judicial rights of cities, and the balance of power in the region. He tried to keep the south relatively autonomous from the northern crown and the papal curia, without severing ties with Rome, but also without becoming a mere executor. It was this position that made him an easy target. A count who did not suppress heresy by force was declared an accomplice to its sins. The murder of the papal legate was a turning point. This crime, committed by people associated with the South, was presented as a direct consequence of heretical corruption. Sermons proclaimed that those who allowed the decay of faith and morals would ultimately raise their hands against representatives of the Church. But in the first months after the murder, documents reveal something else. Preparations began for a crusade in which promises of land and income played a key role. The lands of those infected with heretical vice were declared legitimate spoils for those who would go south with weapons. Large estates associated with the House of Toulouse and other southern lords were considered in advance as future trophies. From this point on, accusations of sexualized heresy begin to serve a fictitious function. In order to convince the knights from the north that they are not going to plunder their neighbors, but to cleanse the world, it is necessary to show that this is a struggle against a threat to the very foundations of society: marriage, family, and control over bodies. Stories about secret beds and women's communities become a moral cover under which the division of Languedoc is prepared. At the same time, Cathar texts and Inquisition protocols recorded later demonstrate an ascetic program that is extremely harsh on the body. But they are hardly heard by those for whom the South has already become a map of future grants. For Raymond VI, this means that any political maneuver on his part is interpreted as moral weakness. An attempt to maintain peace with the cities without resorting to mass slaughter is perceived as evidence of indulgence in debauchery. Papal legates operating in the South are accustomed to combining threats of spiritual punishment with the prospect of confiscation. Any lord who refuses to hand over the Cathars or destroy their hideouts risks having his lands declared a reward for zeal to more obedient knights. And the louder the pulpit describes the vices of the heretics, the easier it is to sign letters in which castles and villages are transferred to new owners for participating in the purification of the region. Everyday life in Languedoc at this time remains recognizable and disturbingly normal. Adult craftsmen marry, take care of their daughters' dowries, and argue with sheriffs about taxes. In homes where Cathar preachers were welcomed, ordinary household chores were carried out. But it was not this routine that would remain in future chronicles, but fire and accusations. Myth would remember sexualized heresy as the cause of the war, while documents would show a coincidence between revealed sins and convenient moments for confiscation. And already at this stage, it is clear that sin in this story is being prepared for the role of a cover for the fiscal agenda, where morals serve only as a language for describing conquest and taxes. The crusade against Languedoc did not begin with the stroke of a sword, but with the construction of an image of the enemy. Sermons circulating in the north increasingly described the South as a land where decay was hidden under the guise of teaching. They spoke of sects that reject marriage, of houses where men and women gather without the blessing of a priest, of secret rituals that are supposedly performed at night. For listeners, these images led to a simple conclusion: if the order of marriage collapses, so does the Christian community itself. At the same time, the chancelleries were preparing lists of fiefs that could be transferred to the participants of the campaign if the owners were declared heretics or their patrons. Moralizing language and accounting tables went hand in hand, creating the same route to the south. After the murder of the legate, which became a pretext, Raymond VI found himself officially placed among the suspects. He was summoned to church hearings, demanded repentance, and promised harsh measures against the Cathars. Outwardly, it looked like a dispute over faith and discipline. Business letters between Paris, the papal curia, and the lords of the north indicated another goal: a legitimate reason to intervene in the affairs of Toulouse and neighboring estates. In terms of wording, the accusation sounded like neglect of the purity of the faith and condoning debauchery and heresy. In practice, this paved the way for the introduction of a foreign army into the region. At that time, the Cathar communities lived their rhythmic, austere asceticism. The perfect ones continued to fast, visit homes, and bless lay people who accepted their teachings, but they themselves remained unmarried, without property, and without the usual family ties. Inquisitorial records made later, when the South had already been defeated, record the memories of adult witnesses of nights spent in prayer, painful fasts, and fear of breaking their vows. This sharply contrasts with the picture painted by the preachers of the crusade. But even these protocols are used selectively. When it is necessary to show insult to marriage, they emphasize that the Cathars did indeed reject the Church's understanding of marriage, while the details of their abstinence are left out. The campaign sought by the papal legates took shape as a coalition of interests. Northern knights sought booty and new lands. The French crown saw an opportunity to expand its influence. The Church sought to strengthen discipline and set a precedent for intervention in the affairs of regional rulers. The accusation of sexualized heresy allowed these motives to be combined. If the enemy is presented not only as politically unreliable, but also as morally corrupt, any action against him is easier to present as purification. Adult men went south, for whom the promised fiefdoms were not an abstraction. Behind each name stood real castles, vineyards, and rights of jurisdiction over the local population. Raymond tried to maneuver. He agreed to certain concessions, promised to persecute heretics, participated in negotiations, and sought alliances with other southern lords. His steps can be traced in charters and treaties, where he acknowledges certain demands, trying not to sever relations with the Church completely. But once the crusade had begun, the Count's personal maneuvers had little effect. His possessions found themselves in the line of fire, not because he had suddenly become more depraved or more tolerant than before, but because the South as a whole was designated as an area infected with heretical sin and suitable for military redistribution. The first major episode to be remembered in the Chronicles will be the destruction of entire communities under the slogan of fighting heresy. In the official description, such events are accompanied by formulas about righteous anger, about the fact that Catholics and heretics allegedly mixed in the cities, about the impossibility of separating the pure from the defiled. Economic documents from the same period record other details: lists of seized property, descriptions of lands passing into the hands of new owners, records of income now going not to local lords, but to foreign knights and their allies. Where stories speak of debauched sects, the margins of documents are filled with notes about tithes, rents, and taxes. The Qatari perfect ones are particularly vulnerable in these clashes. Their way of life is easy to imagine as a challenge. They do not recognize church sacraments, do not enter into holy matrimony, and refuse to take oaths. For the authorities, who rely on sworn allegiance and sacred unions, this looks like a rejection of the very foundations of society. But behind this substantive conflict lies a calculation. If a certain group is declared not simply misguided, but morally dangerous, it is easier to destroy it and deprive its patrons of their property. The protocols would later recall how adult men and women associated with the Qatari movement were deprived of their rights and property, and their former patrons became suspects whose castles and lands were subject to review. Raymond is sometimes an enemy, sometimes a target of pressure, and sometimes a forced ally in this story. He may be recognized again, excommunicated again, used as a negotiator, and then placed under suspicion again. The papal legates pay attention not only to his attitude toward the faith, but also to his ability to control cities where Cathar sympathies are strong. If he cannot or does not want to suppress these sympathies by force, he is portrayed as a ruler unworthy of full power over his region. And each such argument becomes a brick in the wall, separating the South from its former autonomy. At the same time, the influence of the Northern Crown is growing. The French court, which until recently positioned itself primarily as a participant in European politics, now has the opportunity to make the south part of its own domain. The crusade, launched under religious slogans, provides an opportunity to place people loyal to Paris in the conquered lands. Here again, the language of sin serves as a cover. Confiscations and redistributions are explained not as an expansion of royal power, but as punishment for patronizing heresy and immorality. The acts confirming the new grants regularly repeat the motif of the fight against decadence, but behind each such act lies a change in the ownership map. The inquisitorial structures that emerged against this backdrop occupy a special place. They are presented as an instrument of purification, but in fact become part of the administrative network through which the center monitors the loyalty of the local population. Interrogating adult witnesses, coercing denunciations, recording connections with Qatari preachers. All this is not only religious work, but also the collection of information about networks of trust in the South. In the protocols, questions about faith are juxtaposed with questions about who gave their house to whom, who hid whom, who was connected to whom through marriages and deals. Thus, sexualized heresy becomes a convenient excuse for rewriting social ties and replacing old patrons with new ones. Meanwhile, everyday life in Languedoc continues. Adult merchants negotiate salt supplies, winemakers worry about another year, women look after their dowries, and men look after their fields and workshops. But a shadow gradually looms over this routine. Every house that once welcomed a Cathar preacher may become the object of suspicion. Every contract concluded with the participation of people associated with this movement may be reviewed. In such conditions, accusations of heretical debauchery cease to be mere words from the pulpit. They become a threat of severing familiar ties and losing property. The myth, recounted later, often limits itself to the image of a debauched sect and a licentious South that supposedly needed to be brought to order. Documents preserved in notarial archives, inquisitorial protocols, and royal acts show something else: a conscious effort to create an image of a moral enemy that would justify conquest. Raymond VI, his vassals, the cities of Languedoc, and the Cathar communities are part of the same construct, where sin is not an internal state of people, but a label that allows their lands and bodies to be included in the fiscal agenda. And the further the crusade advanced, the clearer it became. Beneath the cries of sexualized heresy was a much more mundane wave of taxes, confiscations, and changes of ownership. And the deeper the army from the north advanced into Languedoc, the more the two layers of reality diverged. In the squares and in the sermons, words were spoken about marriage corruption, seduced communities, and the debauchery of heretics, while in government tents and field offices, lists of lands, vineyards, mills, and port fees were being drawn up. By the beginning of the siege of large cities, it became clear that every episode presented in the chronicles as moral purification was accompanied by a precise inventory of property passing into the hands of new owners. Raymond, who was still allowed to participate in the negotiations, saw that questions about his relationship with the Cathars were turning into accounting tables. Who owned what? Who had the right to collect duties? Which families controlled the crossings and markets? His political influence was diminishing, not because of accusations of debauchery, but because his property structures attracted too much attention from those who wanted to divide the South. The Cathars themselves at this time lived a difficult, exhausting life in flight and under siege. Their asceticism, recorded in later Inquisition testimonies, became even more unlike the image of a debauched sect to outside observers. Adult women who received consolamentum renounced marriage and property. The men who accompanied the preachers lived on alms, slept in barns and granaries, and hid in the suburbs. However, Even these testimonies, collected later under pressure, easily became the basis for accusations. If they rejected marriage, then in the eyes of their opponents, they defiled it. If they lived separately from the parish structure, then they corrupted the community. The language of the hostile chronicles was flexible, allowing any of their characteristics to be presented as a moral threat. The turning point came when new territories fell into the hands of the northern armies. Confiscations were invariably formalized through formulas of patronage of heresy. The lords, who were considered to be connected to the Cathars, became the subjects of investigations, during which, in the presence of adult witnesses, it was not their real sins that were recorded, but what could be attributed to them for the sake of redistributing property. The texts of these acts were often carbon copies. They mentioned connivance, secret meetings, and defiling customs. But the main thing in them is the listing of property passing under the authority of the crown or allied knights. It is the coincidence between moral accusations and financial gains that makes these documents particularly disturbing. It is as if the very structure of power suggested how to turn faith into a tool for taxation. The Parliament of Paris, having gained powerful leverage from the campaign, began to increasingly consolidate its conquests legally. Through a series of court decisions, new rulers of the South, new boundaries of responsibility, and a new map of vassalage were established. At the same time, each such decision necessarily included a reference to defiled teachings, as if they were the very reason for the intervention. In fact, this served as a mechanism of legitimization. Under the guise of fighting heresy, the North consolidated its right to control Languedoc. Raymond, who was still trying to defend his lands, found that every step of his authority was viewed through the prism of moral suspicion, making his status increasingly precarious. The inquisitorial structures, established after the first conquests, cemented this order forever. The interrogation of adult witnesses, peasants, artisans, merchants, was not so much about finding out who really adhered to the teachings of the Cathars, as it was about drawing a network of connections through which loyalty could be traced. The questions boiled down to who stayed overnight at whose house, who gave food, who sheltered preachers. Each answer pulled a chain that could lead to the indictment of the local lord, and an indictment always opened the door to confiscation. The Inquisition became not only a spiritual weapon, but also a means of controlling the economy of the South. On the streets of cities, adults lived under a double threat. On the one hand, fear of the army, which could punish them for any connection with heretics. On the other hand, fear of losing their property at the slightest suspicion. The townspeople had already seen that the names on the lists of confiscated property appeared not only among convinced Cathars, but also among those who had only once given shelter to a preacher or happened to be related to a suspect. Under these circumstances, the concept of sexualized heresy finally became a tool for distributing property. It was enough to prove that a house was defiled by the presence of heretics, and it would pass into the hands of those who participated in the campaign. By this time, it had become clear that Cathar doctrine was being used as a convenient enemy, against which structural changes could appear to be just punishment. Southerners, accustomed to their own system of rights, marriages, contracts, and local courts, found themselves faced with a mechanism that was eroding their autonomy step by step. Raymond, deprived of his former influence and deemed unreliable, became part of a larger process, a process in which religious language served as a facade concealing fiscal goals. The South was slowly losing itself, transforming from an independent world of cities, merchants, and knights into an appendage of the northern system of power, where every sin had a monetary equivalent and was measured in rents, vineyards, and fortresses. And when northern chroniclers described the South as a land of wicked gatherings, things looked different in Toulouse itself. People saw adult men and women gathering in homes for prayer and strict instruction, not for excess. But the sermons preached from the pulpits of Paris insisted on the opposite. The Cathars allegedly destroyed marriages, defiled homes, and drew lay people into immoral practices. These images did not coincide with what would later be recorded in the Inquisition's protocols, which spoke of bread, water, conversation, and abstinence. But for an outside observer, it was more convenient to believe the worst. That way, the war seemed like a matter of salvation rather than conquest. Hello, viewers, and thank you for your attention. Write to us about where you are watching from, and which historical stories about the struggle for faith seem the most cruel to you. I wish you a peaceful and attentive listening experience. Let's move on to the story. Raymond of Toulouse fell into a trap where his every action became evidence against him. If he tried to maintain peace with the cities, it was explained away as indulging in depraved heresy. If he made concessions to the north, he was accused of weakness. Preachers in the north portrayed the south as a place of defiled marriages, although Cathar texts spoke of extreme asceticism, in which the body was considered a source of suffering rather than pleasure. But rumors of wicked teachings were more convenient. They allowed political conflict to be transformed into a field of moral horror and fear. This is especially noticeable in confiscations. Every time the legates announced revealed sins, it was followed by lists of lands, mills, gardens, and houses that were transferred to new owners. Sin became a legal seal, after which the property of Raymond and his vassals could be transferred to those who supported the north. Most often, this was done in acts where heresy was mentioned in one line and rent paid to the crown in the next. The south lived in fear. Any meeting could be called a secret gathering, any conversation a sedition. The inquisitors questioned adult witnesses about the preachers' overnight stays, the exchange of bread and prayers, but the scribes added formulas about moral decay to their reports. Thus, the real asceticism of the Cathars was turned into a political caricature. Raymond became a symbol of a region that needed to be cleansed. He was stripped of his castles, rights, and lands, every step accompanied by rhetoric about a seduced people. But the documents reveal the main thing. The war for Languedoc was a game of control over territory, taxes, and judicial power. The sexualized image of heresy made it possible to turn any action into a reason for intervention. The final result was predictable. The Cathars disappeared, their teachings dissolved, Raymond lost power, and the north consolidated its order. But the myth of the debauchery of the south remained, convenient, catchy, and easy to repeat. The documents, however, revealed a stark truth. Every exposed sin was closely linked to the confiscation and redistribution of resources. Morality served as a backdrop, while the mechanism of war was fiscal and political. The dust of these events settled slowly, and the further away from the artificial noise of sermons, the clearer it became that the South had not experienced a struggle for morality, but a long-term redistribution of power. Raymond of Toulouse, whom northern chroniclers portrayed as almost a patron of debauchery, was in fact the last major representative of a political tradition that was not allowed to survive. His defeat cemented a new order. Lands passed to northern barons, taxes went to the royal treasury, and institutions of control, the Inquisition, courts, fiscal chambers, were strengthened in areas where local customs had previously prevailed. The acts of confiscation show how thoroughly these mechanisms worked. Every house, every mill, every vineyard was described as defiled by heresy and therefore subject to transfer to other owners. The formula was repeated dozens of times, as if the paper itself had to convince those who would read it centuries later that this was not a conquest but a punishment. But the rent figures listed alongside revealed the true goal: control over the region's economy. Meanwhile, the image of the Cathars was becoming firmly established in sermons. They continued to be described as destroyers of marriage, although in the interrogation records, adult witnesses spoke of renouncing food, property, and intimacy. Northern rhetoric turned the ascetic movement into a bogeyman capable of justifying any intervention. This contrast between propaganda and documentation became the main nerve of the whole story. Raymond tried to maneuver, but his every move was interpreted in favor of the prosecution. If he defended his subjects, it was called aiding vice. If he agreed with the legate's demands, they spoke of duplicity. His own letters, preserved in fragments, show a mature ruler who understands that the scale of the accusations is greater than himself, that he has become a symbol, and that it is no longer possible to fight this with political means. When the war finally engulfed Languedoc, it became clear that the myth had played its role. Wicked heresy was a loud shell that allowed Paris and Rome to divide the South, strengthen their institutions, and wipe out resistance under the guise of saving souls. Further documents show that after the fall of the Cathar communities, the system of control was not weakened, but rather expanded. The South became part of a new order where every village and every market was linked to royal authority. And the final silence that remained after these events reveals the most honest essence of what happened. The myth of sexualized heresy dissolved in sermons, chronicles, and later legends. The document preserved something else: lists of property, courts, taxes, and orders. Decisions were made by adult men seeking to consolidate power. Heresy became a convenient mask, and war became a tool through which Languedoc was finally incorporated into the structure of the Northern Kingdom.